As a country, as a diplomatic thing, you want to keep on the Russian side, do keep it, but you don't have to take their narrative hook, line, and sinker. Because after all, there is Ukraine. What about their sovereignty? Don't they have a right to exist? So I think we're just getting carried away with our Russia first policy, but what Russia is doing has serious implications.
So in this week's column, you've looked at, of course, the Ukraine crisis, but in a sort of, as always, in a more in-depth manner, going into the history somewhat. One of the main things you point out is that Delhi so far, even historically, has managed to keep Russia on its right side for various reasons, needing the Security Council veto during the Kashmir problem through the decades, arms deals. We had a certain dependence during the Cold War. We were seen as being closer to Russia. How do you see that now, even between yesterday and today, the fact that it seems to be that there is some chance, at least, that this conflict could continue and, in fact, intensify? How far do you think India can continue to sort of fence it, and which way do you think is best for us to come down on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points we're making is, look, through history, I mean, in the 1956 crisis of Hungary, where the Soviet Union intervened there, Czechoslovakia, India's dependence on the Soviet veto in Kashmir, on Kashmir at the UN Security Council, compelled it to fudge the issues, because the rest of the world is saying, look, you take such thundering positions on, against the West and Western interventions, but you don't speak up against the Russian interventions. In some senses, hypocrisy is not unique to India. All countries do it. But for India, the problem, given the sense of its internationalism, etc., there was a difficulty it had to manage constantly between, the need for Russia while maintaining a foreign policy based on a set of consistent principles. I think that was one dilemma that has now come sharply in the Ukraine crisis, because there is the question, of Russia really saying some things which India, it can duck the issues involved. But what Russia is saying is that, look, Ukraine doesn't exist, it doesn't have sovereignty. So therefore, it is so brazen in terms of what Russia is doing, whether it's in Crimea before or in what it has done yesterday in terms of recognizing the separatist groups backed by it as independent republics. So there is a tension. None of these positions, in India, everyone understands India's compulsion. In the past, it was Kashmir. Today, India relies on Russia for military supplies. But the fact is that it will creep up in inconsistency into India's positions. While we talk about a rules-based order, for example, in Asia, where China is doing something similar, but then we are mum on what Russia does. So while everyone understands our diplomatic finessing, there are costs to it. I think it never comes free. That not being clear on this also has costs in terms of the other partners. And I think that's where, if the crisis continues to escalate, India will find it harder to balance the position, merely talking about diplomacy, de-escalation. But once the sanctions begin and the situation escalates, it's going to get harder for India to manage this balancing act.
So one of the things that Delhi has managed to do is, one of the sort of theories, I don't know if there's any credence to it, but one of is that Russia is also our way to sort of talk to China. As long as we're close to Russia and Russia is close to China, perhaps Russia can be an intermediary, and that is another reason to keep Russia as far as possible. Even if there's if there's an invasion, one doesn't know what we'll have to do. But is there some credence to that Russia is actually the best hope for sort of negotiating with China, keeping China from being more aggressive than it's already been?
No, none at all. Look, I think we have a long history of negotiating with China bilaterally. I don't think any third party is going to help there, and least of all Russia, because this it is really something the Russian propaganda has spread nicely, that they can somehow be the interlocutor between India and China. But the fact is, look, that there are issues directly between India and China, where China is sitting on India's territory, I don't think Russia can persuade them to change their position. If it can be done only on the basis of our bilateral negotiations. So, and Russian talk recently, oh, we will organize a trilateral summit. A trilateral summit was in any case due. Therefore, I think Russians were trying to be, I think, a bit too clever, saying that they can help us with China. But the fact is, China shows no signs of any flexibility. And if they want to show it, they don't need the Russians to tell them. They'll make their judgment on their own.
So one of the arguments, I think one of the things that people will say, I mean, readers and letters, is that our perspective, not our perspective, but the Indian perspective, given how dependent we are on English language media for our news, for our coming out of Russia right now, is that we don't, I mean, we just got a letter to the editor saying something to the effect of, when they say that when Russia say recognized, this is a clear act of aggression. I mean, on the face of it, Russia recognizing the two separatist movements as an independent. There was yesterday, day before yesterday, the parliament had asked Putin to do so, and now he has. Which is it Ukraine, in fact, who to deal with in Ukraine, that the West has its own people and it has a large Russian population, a pro-Russia population, Russia as well within its rights to support, and comparisons being drawn with what India did for Bangladesh. Do you think that is just, again, falling for propaganda, or there's some merit to that comparison?
I think, look, you don't need to know the Russian language to see what Russia is doing. Russia is saying that, look, might is right, and that they would surround Ukraine on three sides by troops, and then say, look, we can, negotiate with the Americans to get a deal with the Americans. Now, I can fully understand as a realist, but to somehow for India, look, just because you're friends with Russia doesn't mean we have to buy into the Russian narrative that Ukraine does not exist. Can you say that to Nepal? Can we say that to Pakistan and India? Look, historically, you're part of me, therefore I have a right to do what I want in your country. So I think we've just, not seeing the gravity of what Russia is doing because Russia is our friend. But I think, okay, you have to manage that. That is the job of the diplomats, but not to see what Russia has done in Crimea, where you annex a territory, do a referendum, and say, yes, I got 95% of the vote, therefore this place is mine. That's exactly what Pakistan tells you. There are Muslims in Kashmir, therefore, do a referendum and it will come to us. So I think this thing of seeing merely from Russia as our friend, therefore what it must be doing right, but the implications of what Russia has done for claiming that you will support a secessionist movement, actually create a kind of a state, theoretically, you recognize that state and then send in your troops. Is that something we will accept if someone does it against us? So I think we become so eager to, buy into Russian narrative. Look, as a country, as a diplomatic thing, you want to keep on the Russian side, do keep it, but you don't have to take their narrative hook, line, and sinker. Because after all, there is Ukraine. What about their sovereignty? Don't they have a right to exist? So I think we're just getting carried away with our Russia first policy, but what Russia is doing has serious implications of how we think about our sovereignty. We are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, diverse country, and we've always opposed secessionism supported by outsiders, the notion of self-determination. So I think these are much more direct principles affecting us. And the government can balance between this, and we need to be nice to Russia, but there is no reason for us to buy the Russian narrative as if that is the truth.
So one of the interesting points you make in your piece, which is not often one doesn't read even in the international media, is that one of the things we see, Central Europe, is Ukraine in particular, Central Europe as a whole, we're not realizing that these are not, it is not that they're blindly desperate to ally with the West on all count, or that all factions. It's a regional entity of its own and now coming into its own with certain regional groupings. In the longer run, do you think that Indian diplomacy has had a gap in that area, particularly the former Soviet republics as well as countries behind the Iron Curtain, in terms of engaging with them not through Russia since the fall of the Berlin Wall, but on their own terms in the last, say, 20, 30
I
years?
think, as I said, look, the problem for India has been, look, it's not just the government, the public. We view Central Europe through the Russian eyes. Because the East-West conflict affected us in one particular way, and Russia was a partner, we see Eastern Europe as if, from the Russian eyes. But Eastern Europe, or Central Europe, if you will, had a long history of being torn between Russia and Germany, of their territories being divided by other great powers. They all resent Russian domination. Now, you might not like that fact, but it will be unwise to ignore that fact, that Poland does not want to go back into Warsaw Pact, that is named after the capital of Poland. Neither Hungary, nor Romania, nor Czech Republic. They're not dying to embrace Russia. In fact, they want the West to support their autonomy, which we always say our strategic autonomy, our independent foreign policy. For them, they need Europe, they need the US to support their autonomy vis-a-vis Russia. Just as some of our smaller neighbors look for outsiders to balance India. So they do the same, but for somehow, because you like Russians, we can't say, look, we don't pay any attention to the others, their history, their interests. Like if you're Swedish, who are a neutral country, but they constantly face Russian submarine incursions into their waters. So they're supposed to simply say Russians are nice, and we just accept it. Would India, Finland, Sweden, the Baltic countries, which many of them now want to get into NATO. See, historically, they stayed away from NATO, for example, Sweden. But if Russia keeps pushing them, they will say, look, we want to be part of NATO. Therefore, I think we need to devote some attention to European history and not say Russia is our friend, therefore whatever Russia does must be fine. And I think that is the problem. Well, diplomats have to finish issues, but for us as a collective, we need to pay the long history of European geopolitics. And within that, there are multiple contradictions within Europe. But to simply say it's Russia is good and everybody else is bad in Europe, I think it reveals utter, unfamiliarity, let alone, knowledge about the region.
Final question, Delhi has so far, because of our dependence ties with Russia, particularly on arms, we've avoided the CATSA sanctions. We've still managed to get the S-400 system without too many consequences. We may have ruffled some feathers. But do you think it's time to we've managed it in the Middle East, in West Asia to some extent, we've managed it with Europe and Russia so far. Time to sort of spread, not be so dependent on one. It's a long-term plan, but even in the shorter term, because in case there are serious sanctions from the West, a post-conflict kind of economic sanctions, India will have to figure out other routes for various supplies. Do you think that even on a medium term that it's time to, what kind of things can we start doing to diversify our basket?
Look, I think India has diversified somewhat since the end of the Cold War. Today, we buy a lot more weapons from the United States. We buy more from Israel and a lot of others. So Russia is not the only supplier, but Russia has a majority of the equipment. For example, when China attacked India in the summer of 2020, India went to Moscow to say, look, make sure that we supplies come properly. So if we want even basic stuff, a lot of that still comes from Russia. While fighter aircraft today come from France and the US, but a lot of the equipment is still with Russia. So therefore, we are dependent on Russia, and particularly if you're in the middle of a conflict with China. But that problem is Israel. So, but the idea, the government has in the last few years, I think, has taken some decisions. For example, more production at home, because for a country of our size, we can't just be the largest importer. We need to produce some basic weapons in India. So there is a decision that look more internal production of weapons. Second, we're also trying to bring in foreign capital, domestic capital to produce these weapons. We've corporatized the ordnance factories. But these effects from these policy changes will take a long time.
Exactly.
And your immediate problem, you are locked in a war with China. You need the Russian weapons. But at the same time, you also know Russia is the best friend of the Chinese these days. That's a paradox. So I think you've got to navigate this in the near term, but over the longer term, yes, we need to diversify so that no large country can be dependent on one country to acquire its basic defense capabilities. And that will impose constraints on you. And that's what it is doing today. If we did not have the dependence on Russian arms, we would be speaking in a different tone today.
Yeah, even simple things. I think people don't realize how much things like guns and tanks. I mean, when
Yeah,
the gun
ammunition,
missile, yeah, I mean,
motors.
yeah, right, sir. So, sir, I think this will be a story that will be in the news for a while, and we will talk about it again soon. Thanks, everyone. You should read the full article, of course. It's on the IndianExpress.com and in the description, probably, wherever you're watching this video. We'll see you next week, sir. Thank you so much.